It is about time to talk about Wehrmacht war crimes in the Second World War. This is quite an extensive, complicated and highly charged topic. As such, I will rely heavily on quotes from experts, especially since this is clearly not my area of expertise. Since we are talking about the crimes of the Wehrmacht, it is of course important to know the basics, namely what the Wehrmacht was and what it was not. First, the Wehrmacht was the official German armed forces in the Second World War, yet there were various other military and paramilitary organizations that were not part of the Wehrmacht, yet were engaged in combat, like the Reichsarbeitsdienst, the Reich-Leberservice, the Volkssturm, the police, and the Waffen-SS. Second, the Wehrmacht had three branches: the Army, das Heer, the Air Force, die Luftwaffe, and the Navy, die Kriegsmarine. This is also in order of importance, whereas the Army was clearly the most important branch of the Wehrmacht. The next definition is about war crimes. For this video I use 3 crimes of the 4 used by the Nuremberg trials. Second, war crimes, violation of the laws and customs of war, including murder and maltreatment of the civilian population in occupied territories, maltreatment of prisoners of war, killing of hostages, looting of private property, and the indiscriminate destruction of towns and places that has no military justification. Third, crimes against humanity. These include murder, enslavement, deportation, and the annihilation of civilians. Fourth, secret agreements which led to the above-mentioned crimes. Now a general overview on the different types of war crimes committed by the different branches. Note that this list is not complete, yet should contain the most crucial crimes and also lesser known ones as well, which in some cases also might overlap or could be considered subtypes. Also keep in mind that both the Luftwaffe and Kriegsmarine had ground units at certain points in the war. As such, various activities that might at first glance only be attributed to the army could be conducted by the other branches as well. The types are as follows: mistreatment and large-scale killing of prisoners of war on the Eastern Front, active participation and support of the Holocaust, anti-partisan warfare. Here sometimes no prisoners were taken and or civilians killed as retributions. Executions, for instance the infamous Commissar Order, which instructed German troops to summarily execute commissars of the Red Army. But this part also included other executions as well, for instance those conducted out of revenge. Requesting SS units for the execution of the Jewish population in the occupied area. Passing on illegal orders and or giving ambiguous orders that allowed and or led to war crimes. Economic exploitation. This covers both ordered and organized looting, yet also non-sanctioned actions of individuals that in some cases also were severely punished. Forced labor. Many divisions on the Eastern Front had Soviet personnel that helped out, some of them voluntary, some of them not. Deportation of civilians. Destruction of civilian property as part of scorched earth policy and other reasons. Establishment of a military brothel system with non-voluntary prostitutes that were either forced or deceived with false promises. Hypothermia experiments conducted on prisoners of war by the Luftwaffe. Handing over prisoners of war to the SD, that was the intelligence agency of the SS, to be executed. We will now look at 3 topics of that list that are in terms of impact probably the most important by far. First, maybe the most striking and educational aspect when it comes to German war crimes is the treatment of prisoners of war, because it clearly shows a huge discrepancy between the Western and Eastern Front. Additionally, in terms of numbers, it is highly significant. Let us start with some numbers here. Serious German and Russian researchers assume that between 5.3 and 6 million Soviet military personnel became Wehrmacht prisoners. For the Western Allies, the number was about 230,000. Of these Western prisoners of war, around 8,348 died. Note that the exact numbers are debated here, but for comparison with the Eastern Front, this is less of an issue. Still, Australian, Canadian, British and American figures on this vary considerably, but all show the same trend, resulting in a death rate of around 3%. So assuming 3% of 230,000 would be 6,900 men. As such, we keep the higher number of 8,348, which is 3.6%. Yet when it comes to the Soviet prisoners of war, the number is in the millions. As a result of catastrophic living and working conditions as well as targeted killings by the Wehrmacht, Gestapo and SS, at least 2.5 million, possibly up to 3.3 million died. The Soviet prisoners of war are thus the largest group of victims of the National Socialist extermination policy after the European Jews. Since we have a range of numbers here, let us do a short recap. For the Western Allies we have a total of 230,000 prisoners of war. For the Soviets we have a minimum of 5.3 million and a maximum of 6 million. In terms of deaths in captivity we have about 8,400 for the Western Allies and a minimum of 2.5 million for the Soviets and a maximum of 3.3 million. When we look at the death ratio for the Western Allies it is about 3.6%. For the Soviets we have a range of values. So let us start with those that produce the lowest ratio, which would be 6 million prisoners of war and 2.5 million dead. This would mean a death ratio of a staggering 42%. Yet if we take 5.3 million prisoners of war and 3.3 million dead, we have an even more staggering death ratio of 62%. Even with the lowest number of 42%, the death ratio for the Soviet prisoners of war was more than 11-fold than those of the Western Allies, whereas the highest number is more than 17 times the ratio of the Western Allies. To put this in contrast with another Axis power, most of you might know that the Japanese in the Pacific were not particularly well known for treating prisoners of war properly, to be very diplomatic. Yet even the Japanese compared to the Germans on the Eastern Front have a better track record. The terrible maltreatment of Allied prisoners of war at the hands of the Japanese in the Second World War is often compared with the much more favorable behavior of the Germans to their prisoners of war, excluding of course the Russians. Indeed, 27% of the Anglo-American prisoners of war held by the Japanese forces died while in captivity, compared with only 4% of those held by German forces. Furthermore, Overmans also looked at Poland, Denmark, Norway, France, Netherlands, Belgium, Yugoslavia, Greece, the United Kingdom and the United States. He notes, if one compares these figures with the death rates of the aforementioned groups of prisoners of war, which generally did not exceed 5% mark, it becomes drastically apparent how much worse off the Soviet prisoners of war were in German custody. Needless to say, such rates cannot be explained by negligence, shoddy logistics, or the hardness of the fighting on the Eastern Front. Additionally, this was not the only major discrepancy. For instance, when it came to sex crimes committed by the Wehrmacht members, these were dealt with very differently as well. Streit noted about the causes of death for Soviet prisoners. 5 major causes led to the deaths of more than half of Soviet prisoners: hunger, completely inadequate housing, the method of deportation, especially in 1941, inhuman treatment, and finally, the murder of certain groups of prisoners. Bartov lists various reasons that explain the inhuman behavior on the Eastern Front, yet notes that most direct causes came from the top. The most direct cause for the criminal activities of the German army in the East and the resulting brutalizing effect that they had on the individual soldier, however, were the so-called criminal orders. This complex of commands issued by the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht and Oberkommando des Heeres on the eve of the invasion of Russia determined to a large extent the brutal conduct of the troops at the front by providing them with a pseudo-legal and disciplinary framework. This seems also in line with Osterloh's view that particularly notes a continuation within the Wehrmacht and especially army policy that conformed to NS ideology. The military leadership made itself an aid to nationalist socialist politics here. From the very beginning, the Wehrmacht High Command and the Army High Command established a hierarchy of different rights and legal security among the prisoners of the various enemy states. The Wehrmacht deliberately violated the provisions of the Geneva Convention in its actions. The decisive criterion for the treatment of prisoners was their position in the nationalist socialist racial hierarchy. But possible reprisals against German soldiers in enemy hands also played an important role. It is also important to note here that there was a shift in treatment of the prisoners of war and other aspects as well. That is very well outlined by Töppel in regard to the planning of Operation Citadel. In fact, the shortage of labor began to play a crucial role even in the military operational planning. Whilst in 1941-1942, 2 million Soviet prisoners of war had been starved to death, it was an explicit objective of the German summer offensive in 1943 to capture as many soldiers of the Red Army as possible so they could be used for forced labor. This is very important to keep in mind that at various points and at various different levels there were changes. For instance, there were protests against the Commissar order. This order meant the captured Soviet commissars were executed and not treated as regular prisoners. The protests were mainly motivated by the fact that the Soviet resistance stiffened once this became known. Similarly, Rutherford notes, military necessity should not be understood as a rigid concept. However, at its essence, it meant that the German army would do whatever was necessary to preserve its combat efficiency and emerge victorious on the battlefield. Thus, how to achieve victory could be understood by various units in different ways. The element that there were various views on how victory could be achieved is very important here. As already outlined in my video about the German blunders regarding Operation Barbarossa, some of the German atrocities were an integral part of Nazi ideology. For the Nazis, the Jews were the real enemy, and their annihilation as such a main objective. Hence, Operation Barbarossa contained inherent genocidal aspects, which are to a certain degree reflected by the huge death ratio among the prisoners, but simply not limited to them. With the transition of the SS and police formations to total genocide between mid-August and the beginning of October 1941, the constellation changed somewhat. On the one hand, military administration participated in many cases in the preparation of the massacres, but on the other hand, a few critical voices were now also heard, such as the protests of the commander of the rear of Army Group North and the events in Borisov or Bilanz. This was an escalation that only changed the relationship between the Wehrmacht and the SS. However, institutional cooperation in the murder of the Jews remained unchanged, both by the units in the rear and by security formations under civilian administration. The field and local commandant's office were often involved in the planning of the massacres. The quartermaster general supplied ammunition for the SS and police formations. Units provided trucks to transport the victims. In some cases, soldiers participated as shooters, and occasionally pioneers blew up the edges of open mass graves to cover up the crimes. Finally, Wehrmacht authorities arrested countless Jews who had fled and handed them over to the murderers. Jürgen Förster summarizes the role of the Wehrmacht in the Holocaust as follows. With regard to the Holocaust, the Wehrmacht acted in various roles. It was perpetrator, helper, confidant, and spectator. This by no means excludes discomfort, contradiction, even resistance. The next major war crime was how the Wehrmacht conducted its anti-partisan warfare. Here again we look at the Eastern Front, especially since the overall dimension is sometimes lost due to the sheer mass that can prevent a more personalized connection. Ordure in France and Lidice in Bohemia and Moravia became memorials because they were unique exemplars of German brutality in Western Central Europe. By liberation, Belorussia could count over 600 villages destroyed and their populations massacred. For the Germans, the Eastern Front, the Ostfront, was since 1941 always the main theater of war. And as the death ratios of prisoners of war clearly showed, it was approached far more brutally. Generally, partisan warfare is even more prone to war crimes, even if both sides try to minimize losses. Yet this was not the case at all here. It is a basic problem of every guerrilla warfare that it levels the differences between combatants and non-combatants. In the case of the German-Soviet war, both sides worked toward this from the very beginning. The social consequences that this had to have for the opposing party as well as for one's own party played no discernible role for either Hitler nor Stalin. For the German leadership, of course, the collateral damage of guerrilla war was not only a necessary evil, since Hitler and his advisors wanted to suppress, decimate or completely exterminate Soviet society anyway. They saw a guerrilla war as an opportunity, as Hitler also admitted bluntly in the directive setting meeting of July 16, 1941. Hartmann continues by outlining the overall dimension in terms of losses by both sides. Belarus alone, the undistributed center of guerrilla warfare, is said to have lost 345,000 people to it. In the entire Soviet Union it was probably about 500,000 people. If on the other hand the losses of the German occupying forces and the Allies in guerrilla warfare can be estimated at about 1/10, then this ratio alone shows how the behavior of the two sides is to be assessed and also their guilt. If you look at these crimes, it becomes rather apparent that some clearly originated at the very top, whereas others are less clear-cut and could originate at the bottom. This brings us to the problem of the macro and micro level. As pointed out by Rutherford, who studied 3 German infantry divisions and their behavior on the Eastern Front, he notes, "Not each division engaged in each component of Vernichtungskrieg, war of extermination, and each division approached these issues with a varying degrees of professional comportment, ideological intensity, and situational awareness. In other words, the master narrative that views the Wehrmacht as a willing tool in Nazi attempts to destroy Soviet state and society in preparation for German colonization, that certainly holds true on the macro level, needs to be looked at more closely on the micro level. Yet even looking at the divisional level might not be enough. As Peter Lieb noted in a review about a specific division, that one regiment in particular committed the most crimes, and of that regiment a particular battalion. Which just shows the further one goes down, the more complicated the situation becomes. To summarize, it is rather apparent that the Wehrmacht as an organization, specifically at the very top and with its high-ranking commanders, gave orders that were clearly criminal and immoral, also by the standards of the time. The Wehrmacht as an institution was largely integrated into the ruling system of National Socialism by mid-1940 at the latest. A widespread consensus among the commanders and large sections of the officer corps that mass violence against civilians was necessary in the Eastern Campaign lowered the moral threshold compared to earlier wars and campaigns. The development over time was not entirely straightforward, yet there was no major change in direction. If the first mass murders were still carried out under the premise that the campaign had to be ended soon with a maximum use of force, limited criticism of total extermination of the Jews was voiced in the meantime. But with flaring up of partisan war, the inhibitions fell again. After some time, the necessity of radical action against innocent civilians was also debated, not least under the impression that the war would be increasingly difficult to win. Thank you here to Andrew and Military Aviation History for reviewing the script. Yet keep in mind that any errors are my own. Also special thanks to Markus Faulkner for helping me with sources on the Kriegsmarine. As always, sources are listed in the description. Thank you for watching and see you next time.